I was 50 years old and carried with me a deep sadness, a shadow that had accompanied me since the devastating loss of Emily, the great love of my life, more than 20 years ago. I was never able to truly recover from the overwhelming pain I felt when she left. Instead, guilt and regret became my constant companions, eating away at me from the inside, turning each day into a silent struggle against the darkness. I spent my nights in the dark, lying in a bed that always seemed too big, too empty. Emily's memories were so vivid that it felt like she was still right there by my side. I often found myself reliving those moments, desperately trying to find where I had failed. What if I had done something different? What if I had insisted that she not go out on that fateful day? These thoughts circled incessantly in my mind, a self-imposed torture that fueled my depression. During the day, I wandered around the house, now a lonely shrine of my memories. The walls were covered with photos of Emily, each capturing a moment of happiness that now seemed to belong to another life. I would sit in the armchair she liked so much, feeling the texture of the frayed fabric under my fingers, and let the tears fall freely. The people around me, friends and family, had tried everything to pull me out of this abyss, but I walked away, preferring solitude to the company of anyone other than Emily. It was on one of those lonely nights, when the pain seemed unbearable, that something extraordinary happened. I was in the room, holding the little pocket watch Emily had given me on our first anniversary together. I stared at the object, my tears falling on the glass, and felt a mixture of despair and hope. Suddenly, the clock began to glow with intense light, filling the room with an almost magical glow. Stunned and heart-racing, I felt an inexplicable force envelop me, as if I was being pulled to a place beyond time and space. When the light finally faded, I found myself in a familiar but disturbingly different setting. I was in a sunny park, surrounded by people who looked strangely familiar, but who wore clothes and behaved in a way I hadn't seen in decades. Confused, I looked around, trying to understand where I was and why everything looked so old. At first I thought that I was dreaming, or that my mind, burdened with pain, was playing a cruel trick on me. I walked through the park, closely observing the details, the vintage cars passing by, the outdated clothing styles, and even the prices of newspapers at newsstands. Nothing seemed to make sense. It was as if I had been transported to another time. As I walked, an uneasy feeling began to take hold of me, confusion mixed with a growing sense of familiarity. I was there, but I didn't know how or why. The pocket watch, still warm in my hand, pulsed with an energy of its own, as if it were the key to the mystery that surrounded me. I pressed the clock to my chest, trying to find some logic in what was happening. As the reality of what I saw began to take hold in my mind, I realized that I was somehow back in the past. But why? And how? These questions echoed in my mind, with no clear answers. I walked to the park pond, looking at my reflection in the water. To my surprise, my face looked younger, as if it had gone back in time along with the environment around me. Confusion mingled with growing hope as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I approached a gentleman who was sitting on a nearby bench, still trying to process everything. "Excuse me, sir," I began, my voice shaking a little from the intensity of my emotions. "What day is today?" The Lord looked at me curiously before answering. "Today is June 17th, 1998. A shiver ran down my spine. That was the day Emily died. "Please, what time is it?" I asked quickly, struggling to contain the urgency in my voice. The gentleman checked his wristwatch and said, "It's almost noon." My heart raced. I had only 1 hour to try to change the course of events, to save Emily from the tragedy that had haunted me for so long. The reality of what was before me began to take hold, and a mixture of fear and determination gripped me. Without hesitation, I firmly held the pocket watch that seemed to pulsate in my hands and dashed through the park, each step a race against time to try to correct the fate that tormented me so much. All I knew was that somehow I had a chance. The universe had given me a unique opportunity that I never imagined was possible. And with this opportunity, a single mission filled my heart: to find Emily again and try to prevent her death, no matter what the cost. I ran out of the park and quickly found myself on the busy streets of the city. Every step was driven by urgency and the desperate hope of changing the fate that had haunted my life for so many years. I knew where Emily worked at that time, just a few blocks away. My mind was focused on getting to her before the clock struck fatal noon. As I ran, the people around me seemed in slow motion. The world around me blurred as I focused only on the goal ahead. My legs burned, my heart pounded in my chest, but each obstacle was just another challenge to overcome in my race against time. I had to walk a few blocks. Luckily, my young body again obeyed my mind. Finally, I spotted the building where Emily worked. The clock at the top of the building struck a few minutes before noon. A mixture of hope and despair washed over me as I ran to the entrance of the building. My mind echoed with the sound of screeching tires, the sound of impact, and the pain that changed my life forever. But now I was there to stop it. I arrived at the building panting, my heart beating so loudly that it seemed everyone around me could hear it. Emily had not yet left work when I finally saw her. My heart was filled with relief, dread, and longing. She was about to leave for lunch, her usual smile on her lips as she said goodbye to her coworkers. There was no time for hesitation. I ran up to her, calling her name with the urgency of one who saw the future that could be changed. Emily, wait a minute, I shouted. My voice choked with the emotion of finding her again and being able to save her. She turned to me, the surprise stamped on her face at seeing me there, so out of place at that moment. I looked like a madman, but I knew I couldn't let this chance slip away. I had to save her, no matter what. Ethan, what are you doing here? Shouldn't I be at work? She asked, with a mixture of concern and curiosity in her voice. Panting and still trying to catch my breath, I held her shoulders gently. Emily, we need to wait here for a while. I'll explain everything later, I promise. It's important, I replied, with urgency and determination in every word. She frowned, clearly confused by my sudden and energetic approach. Before she could say anything, a deafening noise echoed through the room. A car had crashed into the entrance of the building where Emily worked, causing a frenzy of screaming and running among those present. The impact of the accident was instantaneous. Everyone around ran outside to check what had happened, leaving Emily and I temporarily isolated at the entrance to the building. I looked at Emily, my heart pounding with a mixture of relief and awe at what I had just avoided. Emily looked at me with wide eyes, finally realizing the seriousness of the situation. Ethan, what's going on? She asked, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to explain everything. Emily, me? I went back in time. I began, choosing my words carefully. I came here to save you. You were meant to. Having an accident. I couldn't let that happen. Emily looked at me, her eyes reflecting a mixture of shock and disbelief. But after a moment, something changed in his gaze. She held my arm firmly, a silent understanding passing between us. You saved my life? Emily murmured, her voice almost lost in the chaos around us. I nodded, unable to contain the smile that formed on my face. Yes, Emily. Now everything will be different. We have a new chance. Emily looked at me, her eyes filling with tears as the reality of what had just happened began to unfold before us. The future that once seemed so bleak and inevitable was now full of possibilities and hope. As the chaos of the accident continued to unfold around us, we hugged each other, knowing that our lives were about to take a completely new and unexpected turn. Emily looked at me, her eyes filling with tears as the reality of what had just happened began to unfold before us. The future that once seemed so bleak and inevitable was now full of possibilities and hope. As the chaos of the accident continued to unfold around us, we hugged each other, knowing that our lives were about to take a completely new and unexpected turn. The people around, still perplexed by the miraculous accident they had just witnessed, began to crowd around us, trying to understand what had happened. Ethan, how is that possible? Emily muttered, still in shock, as paramedics rushed to help at the scene of the accident. I took a deep breath, holding her tenderly. I don't know, but I've spent the last 20 years dreaming of you. And now, here we are. Together. You're safe, Emily. Emily looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and admiration, her eyes meeting mine in search of answers that only time could reveal. For me, the weight of 2 decades of loneliness and regret began to slowly dissipate. I had done the unthinkable, altered the course of fate to save the love of my life. I did not understand how, but I imagined that this was something that only passionate hearts were capable of doing, something that even science does not explain. As the curious stares and murmurs of passers-by filled the air around them, we knew that from that moment on, our lives were intertwined for a second chance. The future, once uncertain and painful, now stretched out before us with the promise of new beginnings and a renewed love. Emily and I returned home, embraced and beaming with happiness. The feeling of having saved his life was indescribable, but a dark thought began to haunt me. My current version still existed in this altered present. The thought of sharing Emily with another version of myself was devastating. As we walked down the street lit by the setting sun, Emily noticed my worried expression. "Ethan, are you okay?" she asked, touching my arm tenderly. I forced a smile and replied, "Yes, I just feel a little nauseous. Maybe it's the effect of time travel." But inside, I knew that the unease came from the terrible certainty that even though I had altered the past, my present version still existed, perhaps still linked to Emily in some way. What could I do? My mind ran in circles, searching for a solution that didn't exist. As I struggled with my thoughts, a bold and desperate idea began to form. I needed to make sure Emily was truly mine, without interference from the past. It was a crazy idea, maybe impossible, but I was willing to do anything to secure our future together. Emily, noticing my change in mood, squeezed my hand with concern in her blue eyes. "Ethan, what's going on? You seem distant." I swallowed hard, determined to keep my darkest thoughts to myself. "Nothing, Emily. I'm just processing all this." She nodded, not completely convinced, but respecting my need for space. As we continued to walk down the quiet street, the weight of my decision hung over me, making me question how far I was willing to go to ensure our happiness. I knew that my version of the gift would arrive in the evening. I vividly remembered that painful day when I was on a business trip and received that terrible call that would change my life forever. I had to rush back to the city, but if everything went as planned, I would be very late. This gave me time to plan meticulously, to make sure everything went perfectly. Emily would be mine alone. As we walked home, I kept my dark thoughts locked deep away from Emily's gaze. She was next to me, smiling and talking about the future that now seemed bright and promising. However, the shadow of my decision hung over me, a choice that I knew would change everything irreversibly. The hours dragged on, and even with Emily by my side, I felt that she was still not completely mine, until finally, Emily, tired from the day, went to the bedroom to sleep. I stood in the room, looking out the window at the night that was beginning to stretch over the city. The loneliness of home echoed around me, contrasting with the sense of urgency I felt. I knew what I needed to do. I had to act before it was too late. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that were raw. I took the car key and quietly left through the back door. The weather was cold and biting, but I could barely feel the cold. My mind was focused, determined. I drove through the empty streets of the city, heading to the place where I knew I would find my other self. Fear and uncertainty whispered in my mind, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Finally, I arrived at the scene. I parked the car and surveyed the area, making sure no one was around. I knew it was risky, but there was no other choice. Finally, the company bus arrived and parked there, and I saw myself get off. I looked at my other self, who was there, lost in thought without knowing what would happen to him. It was strange to see myself, watching him from afar, knowing that our destinies were about to fork irreversibly. I let him walk out, and then by car I followed him unnoticed, waited for him to be crossing a dark and deserted street, and then I approached silently, my heart pounding in my chest. He turned, surprised. But before I could react, I put my hands around his neck, silently suffocating him. He struggled for a moment, but I knew what was at stake. I kept the pressure on until his eyes closed and he collapsed to the floor. I stood there, shaking with adrenaline and shock. I looked at my other self, now inert on the ground. Guilt and remorse began to creep in, but I knew it was too late to turn back. I dragged him to the car by putting him in the trunk. I needed to get rid of my own body, with the weight of what I did weighing on me. I put the body in the trunk and drove towards a lake near the city. The night was dense and silent. Only the headlight of the car cut through the darkness of the road. My thoughts were in turmoil, trying to process what I had just done and what I needed to do next. While driving, nervousness increased with every kilometer. I repeated to myself that I was doing nothing wrong. After all, that was my own body, trying to justify my act. However, the thought of being caught by the police still haunted me. Suddenly, the red and blue lights of a car flashed behind me. My heart raced. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm as I pulled the car to the side of the road. The officers approached slowly, their flashlights illuminating the interior of the vehicle. "Good evening, sir," said one of the policemen with a serious tone. I tried to control my voice, replying, "Good night, officer. Any problems?" The officers looked at me suspiciously. "We have received reports of a vehicle with similar characteristics to yours involved in a suspicious incident," said the second officer, watching me intently. I tried to keep his story simple and compelling. "I was just driving home. I'm not aware of any incidents," I replied, trying to appear as calm as possible. The officers exchanged glances, seeming to deliberate among themselves. After a few tense moments, the first policeman said, "Could we take a look at the trunk of your car, sir?" My heart jumped in my throat. I knew I couldn't let the cops open the trunk. "Excuse me, officers, but I prefer not to allow this without a court order," he said firmly, hoping that his answer would be enough to drive them away. The officers exchanged glances again and laughed, clearly suspicious. Then the officers opened the trunk and were perplexed to find the body inside. Quickly, I was handcuffed and taken to the police station. I thought what I was going to do, but officially I was not wrong. I had only eliminated a copy of myself. I was still alive, and it did not matter. Meanwhile, they argued among themselves about the bizarre situation they had just found. At the police station, when questioned, I tried desperately to explain that that body was my own, that I had gone back in time to prevent Emily's death. But my words only increased the discomfort and awkwardness of the police officers, who looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and concern for my sanity. I was placed in an interrogation room while police officers investigated the identity of the body found. I felt trapped in a surreal nightmare, trying to convince everyone that I was trying to do good, even though the circumstances were extremely complicated and difficult to explain. As I waited, I reflected on how everything had gone wrong so quickly. I had hoped that my courageous action of going back in time to save Emily would change our life forever, but now I found myself in an even more complicated and dangerous situation than before. The story seemed so absurd to the officers that I underwent a psychiatric evaluation while waiting for Emily to be called to the police station that morning to give evidence. "What's going on, Ethan?" Emily asked, confused and worried. "They don't understand, Emily. I went back in time to save you," Ethan muttered, staring at her. Ethan was sitting in the cell, had been arrested, life imprisonment, was now in the cell, lost in his tumultuous thoughts. Emily's unexpected visit left her heart in pieces. He stared at the cold bars and dirty prison floor, trying to assimilate everything that had happened. Her voice still echoed in his mind. "I met someone." Her words resounded like a hammer hitting her chest. Ethan couldn't understand how it had all gone wrong. He thought that by saving Emily, they would have a new chance together. But the reality was cruel and unforgiving. The days in prison dragged on slowly. Ethan felt like a stranger in his own body, as if he was trapped not only physically, but also emotionally. Sadness and loneliness consumed him as he relived every moment since he had gone back in time. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he remembered the pocket watch that had brought him there, and his thoughts oscillated between regret and anger. He spent his days imagining how different it would be if he had made different choices. But the reality was unforgiving, and he was there, paying for his own actions. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.